So hello and welcome. Thank you to our great panelists for being here today, and to you, of course, for coming to listen. We have a very fancy title, but for those not familiar with the sector, it is all about nature. I'm told that this is the first time nature has been at the Hello Tomorrow Summit, which to my mind is quite late, but obviously delighted that we're talking about it today in 2024. I just wanted to say quickly, the nature movement is about protecting, managing, and restoring ecosystems and nature in our world. So protecting would be, for example, not cutting down rainforests. Managing would be improved farming practices, for example, and then restoring would be actually planting forests or planting mangroves, for example. Nature tech would be supporting, or tech that supports a nature-positive world. I'd love to get a bit of a temperature check from the audience. Who before today has heard of nature tech? Hands up. Okay, good. And who's investing in nature tech? Okay, that gives good sense. And what about working in nature tech? Any nature tech entrepreneurs? Super, good. So I hope that the audience will be inspired by this panel and go away with something, whether it's an investment opportunity or a business idea, but really just inspired to get involved in the nature movement. Let's start with something fairly basic, or may seem basic, but Axel, could you tell us, why is nature so important?
So, first of all, of course, nature is important in and out of itself, right? For its beauty, the recreation, the spirituality that it can give us. But we are in a market economy. And if you look at nature through the lens of a market economy, you actually realize how critical or foundational nature is to that economy working properly. In 2019, the World Economic Forum published that just almost half of the global GDP was moderately or highly dependent on nature. And PwC reran the numbers last year, and they got a slightly higher number at 55%. So there's really a massive part of the economy that relies on nature. So when you think of it, this is your food, your beverage industry, of course, your wood, your paper, but also cosmetics, also drugs and pharmaceuticals, some chemicals. So a lot of the economy relies on nature delivering the ecosystem services that it does so today freely. So we are reliant on the provisioning, supplying, regulating services for everything to work correctly. And biodiversity is a very important component of nature working well. And there also, it's a little bit challenging. Biodiversity is quite under stress at all levels. If you think ecosystem, if you think species, a lot of it has been degraded. We work, as you said, in land restoration. So we work on very degraded land. Maybe there's been a wildfire, or there's been some overgrazing, overfarming, or infestation. And the soil is so depleted that nature really is not going to come back on its own. Biodiversity is not going to come back on its own for a very long time. And even if it does, it's not going to come back exactly the way it was. It's probably going to be suboptimal. And this is a large problem because you have around 2 billion hectares. Let me repeat this, 2 billion hectares of degraded land worldwide. So there is a major challenge, the major crisis on both things. It's a bit of a bleak picture I'm painting here, but there is some good news, is that really nature can also be and should be a very big part of the solution. So the nature-based solution that you mentioned, it's estimated that they can bring a third of the contribution towards the climate mitigation that we need to have. So that's also very exciting because it will contribute not only to the carbon sequestration, but also to bringing biodiversity and fresh water, all the things that are needed for the economy to run. There again, maybe a slight issue is that there is a funding gap, and nature-based solutions today are not getting all the investment that they need to really truly scale up. It's estimated that it's about a third funded. So there is a big challenge, but always a big opportunity for nature and for nature-based solution.
Thanks. And Nicola, what's your take?
So I come from the marine side of things, so I tend to look at everything through the lens of water. And so many of the problems that were just highlighted are the same. And I think what is overlooked very much in a general perspective is just how important nature is in sustaining many of the technologies and food production, resource management that we're into. So on the terrestrial side, there's quite a few things that are understood. We have a fairly reasonable understanding for how the systems are working and how to restore them. In the marine domain, we're still faced with a huge amount of uncertainties. We don't know what the right things are to look at and to invest in. So at the moment, we are, from a monitoring perspective, looking at everything because we don't know what the most important things are. So we have the same knowledge gaps, but in some cases, I would say even harder. There is a lot of interest in nature in general, but what we see very often is that people shy away from the marine domain because of the technical complexities. What we hear very often is, yes, it's much easier for me to go out and dig up a bucket full of soil in my backyard than having to get a vessel and go out and sample in the sea, never mind the deep sea. So there's a perception of a technological barrier, and it's not just a perception, it is a reality. But at the same time, the potential in the marine environment is huge. And when actually you're looking at the investments that have been done, for example, on marine-derived drugs, has had a much higher success rate than those that are from a terrestrial point of view. So the amount of diversity that is there also means that there's much more potential. And the diversity which was touched upon is actually a really important part. I mean, we talk about biodiversity all the time. And biodiversity really is, when we talk about biodiversity, it's everything that's living in our ecosystem. Plants, animals, microorganisms, everything. And I think a broader understanding than that isn't really necessary. You can come at it from many different points of view. But the diversity component is a really important bit. A population that is genetically diverse is what allows it to cope with climate change, with pollution, adaptation, and so on. And that diversity is what we can harvest and that we can look for opportunities for novel products and novel technology. And on biodiversity, very often the topic very quickly gets towards conservation or protection or regulation. And this is, of course, a necessity. We know that we have a biodiversity crisis today. But I think we also then overlook some of the opportunities that are there. First of all, just in the opportunities of monitoring, there's a huge interest in sensors, in robotics, things that we don't have today. There's also a huge potential that's not being discovered or explored that much in terms of biomimicry, for example, which is just taking inspiration from the sea. And when you start digging into this topic, you start to see new robotics. You start to see novel body armor. You start to see new glue. You see a whole range of things that most people wouldn't necessarily associate with the topic of biodiversity. So nature in many ways are being overlooked when we're focusing on a chemical or a technological solution, where we may have simpler and better solutions adapted already if we look directly to nature for inspiration.
Thank you. Very good point. Laurie, I worked on a report with Nature for Climate and Serena, the French VC firm, about the state of nature tech. And it showed a huge surge of VC investment in nature tech. And it was starting to become a category of its own, so not a subset of climate tech or green tech as it had been considered before. Can you just give us a little bit of a background of why nature tech is so important, building on what Axel and Nicola said, and also why you think investment in nature tech is growing and needs to grow more?
And I invest in both nature tech and also climate tech. And if you look at the landscape, yes, it's growing, but it's still small. Mm-hmm. So in terms of VC, the last 5 years, nature tech received roughly $7.5 billion. Looks big. Mm-hmm. But when you look at climate tech, it received $140 billion. So it's nothing. We need more investment there because especially when we think about climate change. A lot of the money is going into reducing carbon emissions. Yes, we need that. But even if we were to stop all of our emissions today, we will still not get back to temperature from pre-industrial time. That's because CO2 has a lifetime of hundreds of years. So we need nature to help us sequester carbon, and so we need more investment in those technologies. And to me, nature tech and deep tech can play a huge role in terms of, for example, scaling ecosystem restoration. I'll give you just a quick example, reforestation. We have a company that is using drones to plant trees and to plant a variety of trees depending on the ecosystems they are looking at. With one drone, a drone can plant 120 seeds per minute. With just 6 drones, you could plant 1 million trees in a day. And if you look at the carbon debt we have to the planet today, 1 trillion trees could solve that. So just deep tech can scale those activities, and so we need more of those technologies in the market.
Yeah, thank you. Well, that gives us a really good basis, I think, for what we're going to talk about today. I wanted to just dive into some of the challenges that are that we have in creating this nature-positive world, and that tech can potentially help us solve. We do have time for Q&A at the end, so please do send your questions through on the app, and I'll make sure to ask as many as possible. Axel, perhaps you could start us off. What's the biggest challenge that you see that tech can help us solve in this area?
Yeah, good question. I think there are many things, and I'm sure we'll cover all of them. So I'll start with probably the first one, which is we do need the investment, and tech, I think, helps to bring the confidence of what will come from the investment that's been made by corporations. I just want to maybe react on what you mentioned, because yes, absolutely, we need a lot of things to happen, but one of them is we need to look at carbon. We also need to look beyond carbon and decarbonization. This needs to happen. It's absolutely clear, and it's very encouraging to see a lot of companies that were present at the summit with novel ways of sequestering carbon. But some of the challenges I see is that we need to go beyond carbon, right? So we need to do also all the effort around biodiversity on land or on sea. I think we should not be fighting against each other there. So we need to go beyond that. We also need to look at fresh water. All these come together, and it's beyond carbon. I think the other thing we need to do is exactly what you said, is we need to go beyond just offsetting. There is right now a little bit this trend towards, oh, hey, we'll just go to net zero. But everything has accumulated, so we need to go beyond net zero. We need to restore. And that's, I think, a second thing that's really important. And to do both of those things, I think we will need to go beyond value chain. So right now, I think a lot is looking at what can happen within my value chain for corporations. And again, that's absolutely needed, and they should be doing that. But a lot of nature is not going to happen in the value chain. And we need to have space for just a natural nature in our ecosystem. So these three things need to be part of a big transformation towards being nature positive. And I think in parallel, you see a lot of advances as well around impact weighting accounting, right? Those will be big fundamental structural changes that will enable everyone to value and invest in nature in the way that it should. Now, Nicolas also mentioned biodiversity can be complex, and I think one of the challenges around it can be that it leads us a little bit in paralysis, because there's already a lot of data, and it's much harder to comprehend than carbon. Carbon is a ton, is a ton, is a ton. Biodiversity is different. There are many different ecosystems, and how do you compare them? Well, you shouldn't. They probably all should be protected. But I think the complexity can lead to some paralysis, or also sometimes the fear, well, we have data, but we don't have the full data. And that would be really a shame to not, at this point, keep going. It's a very exciting time, I think, because there are so many new technologies that are coming. We were talking about environmental DNA. We're going to learn huge amount, and that will enable companies like ours, right, who are replanting on places, on land that are so depleted that it's really hard. It takes actually a lot of technology to bring those ecosystems back. So it's very exciting to have new tools like eDNA, but also bioacoustics, which get much better also with AI. So it becomes much less manual. You can have AI help you to recognize what are those different sounds, so you can know what is the diversity you have in there. Same for camera traps, also enhanced by AI. So it's a very, very exciting time, I think, for this to embrace the technology. It might not be yet perfect. It might be a bit overwhelming and not perfect. But I think for the leaders, and I think here we need leaders among investors, among corporations to take that leap. Now, of course, I think the environment around them from a framework or pre-regulatory perspective helps. We just had CSRD getting started in January in 2024, so it's very recent, but it demands large organizations to disclose both their dependency and their impact on nature. At a global level, you also have TNFD. So all of this also creates the right context for organizations to understand how dependent am I and what is the impact I have. So all of this, I think, will help us overcome the challenges of, is it, should I invest in nature? And overall, we think there is a very positive case also from financial terms of investing in nature. And that is really encouraging to see more and more people engaging and responding to that.
Thank you. Lara, do you want to build on that in terms of the investment case?
Yeah, and maybe in terms also of challenges. I mean, when you see all of the wildlife that we've lost in the last 50 years, I think we lost 70% of the wildlife population. When you see the climate destabilization we are experiencing everywhere in the world, we really need to act now. But what I'm thinking right now, I think we have entrepreneurs, we have new companies that are funded, focused on nature-based solutions, but I'm seeing the same trend we had in Clean Tech 1.0. Where perhaps it's a bit of naivety, and I've been part of Clean Tech 1.0, so I've learned from the mistakes where building novel solutions, nature-based solutions, it's not enough. We live in a capitalistic world. We need solutions that are going to be embedded in our societies, that have business models that are going to make sense and that are economically viable. And to me, I see two challenges today: unit economics, so solutions that are often too expensive to be deployed at scale, and scalability. And so I think we really need to focus on those two aspects, again, unit economics and scalability, to make nature-based solution, nature tech, really, again, grow fast, because we need to act now. We don't have time. And so we need solution as soon as possible. But I'm very hopeful. Just giving you a quick example. So I mentioned we invest in climate tech, we invest in nature tech. We launched our first fund 4 years ago, and we already have 2 unicorns in the fund. One of them is focused on CO2 offsetting. The other one is focused on biodiversity preservation. So there are paths to make lots of money with nature-based solutions. So we need just more investors and to focus on the right business models.
And more people who are willing to take on the risks of doing the entrepreneurs themselves, yeah. Nicholas, would you like to say a little bit more about that and about the challenge of the understanding around this area? So, we're trying to get these people inspired and trying to get more entrepreneurs to take up these challenges. But what are the challenges in terms of getting the tech minds to understand ecosystems and biodiversity?
It's a tough job coming after you too, because you are very thorough in covering the landscape. So. There's 2 points I think I would first focus on, and the first one is the point on knowledge gap and complexity. And a big part of our ability to employ nature tech solutions and nature tech in general depends on us having a good understanding of the system and what happens when we start to interfere in it. And these, unfortunately, in nature, very few things are simple. And so if we take, for example, the example of the drones with planting the trees, we hear a lot about planting trees and how much we can do with it, and this is absolutely true, but what tree we plant really matters. And planting the wrong tree can have a really, really negative impact. Yeah. We see it as well, for example, on honeybees. This has been a big topic. We need to protect our pollinators and so on. Absolutely. Everybody goes out and protects honeybees. What about the other 100 species of honeybees that are equally important for ecosystem equilibrium? So oversimplified solutions tend to have really negative impact. Yeah. And this is really difficult also in terms of regulation and in politics, where people want simple solutions. They hear sound bites and they hear components and they try and act on them, but they're usually too simple. And I think what we're missing is a much closer discussion and interaction between business and academia. There's too big of a gulf between the two sectors. One that is, yes, unfortunately, sometimes glacial in our way of doing things, and on the other hand, super motivated people who want to do things yesterday. Mm-hmm. And getting those two to work together is a challenge, and I think this is really something we need to overcome if we want to have good solutions. The other thing I think that we mustn't forget, I do really support the argument that let's not just focus on carbon. And I am also a bit tempted to say it is the easy one because it's easy to understand. It's absolutely necessary, yes. If we're going to make massive investments into nature restoration and biodiversity restoration and so on, we really need to address the causes. Because the analogy I saw, I think it was yesterday, which I thought was quite good, was it's all very good to create a marine protected area. But if everybody's still sick, they're still going to die. So if we're not addressing the underlying problems of climate change, of pollution, and so on, those restorations won't last in time, and the impacts will therefore not, in the long run, have the right effect. And so where I think really we should be looking a lot more in terms of tech is alternative products, alternative solutions. So we know in the marine domain there's an awful lot of money going into paints, for example, on ships, which is a huge pollution source. I also saw recently, the other day, the billions of dollars spent every year on treating rust. All of these things are problems. They're paints, they're chemicals that we use in the environment, or glues, or whatever it is. We need to have alternative products that are not having a heavy toll on the environment, that are not super resource intensive to produce, that are recyclable, that are biodegradable. This is the direction that our tech and our industry needs to go, because we are not going to solve the problem by restoring the damage that we've done and trying to sequester some of the carbon we're producing. It's a fundamental problem that we need to address. And I'd be interested to hear, actually, also from the investor side of things, if you're going to be investing in a new initiative for whether it's carbon restoration or whether it's restoring biodiversity, I would imagine you'd also want to know that in 15 years that investment was sound. And so presumably it would then also make a lot of sense to encourage work and investment in the alternatives that will address the reasons for why we have biodiversity loss.
Yeah, would you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, I fully agree with that.
And maybe about the tech that investors require as well, because that's part of nature tech, isn't it? The kind of monitoring and the data and that tech.
Yes, it's definitely part of it. We need monitoring. For example, I'm spending lots of time on agriculture. Agriculture and the industrialization of agriculture is terrible. We need to produce food, but we need to change the way we produce food. And an example is tracking soil carbon and soil health. Today there is no sensors, no tools that allow to do that in a very exhaustive way and really understanding the health of the soil. So we need to develop those technologies to make sure that the novel agricultural practice that we develop actually have a beneficial impact. So we need monitoring, but at the same time, I want to invest in the solutions. in the things that are going to make the restoration happen, to make our ecosystem healthier. And there are a wide range of technologies here. It can be biotech. And for example, we have a company that is using extremophile bacteria in those very remote areas that are helping crops to grow by making the nutrients from the soil available to the roots, and using the same bacteria in agriculture to make the soil of farms in depleted area much better to allow crops to grow. I'm also looking at robotics to help us, again, scale ecosystem restoration activities. And we talked about DNA and again, biotech in terms of making sure we have DNA libraries of the species that are close to extinction to make sure we don't lose species again. So there is a wide range of technologies out there that can serve biodiversity. But again, back to investors who want to see businesses that are going to scale. And if the companies, nature-based companies, are financially successful, it means they will be big, and it means the impact will be much bigger. So again, I think it's very important to think about the business side of things when we think about nature-based solutions.
And how do you do that due diligence, and how do you to protect against some of the things that Nicholas is talking about, like the, like going off in the wrong direction, or tech that might be good for one specific area but isn't good for another area? How do you do that due diligence?
So when we do the due diligence, two things, I look unit economics and scalability. So unit economics, it's really understanding the cost. How much is it going to cost to your customers to deploy this solution? And sometimes again, I'm taking the example of agriculture, but in terms of reducing the amount of pesticides that we use. I mean, in terms of pesticides for populations that are close to those farms, it's terrible. In terms of pollinators, we know we are losing lots of pollinators because of pesticides. You have technologies today, for example, smart weeding, where you end up applying 95% less herbicides or pesticides, can be even completely cutting the application while having the same efficacy. And for a farmer, it's much cheaper. They don't have to apply the chemicals anymore. So I'm looking at those wins in terms of unit economics, and then during the due diligence, we need to make sure that the solution is addressing a business problem, a customer problem. So talking to customers, who is going to buy the solution? The company I mentioned earlier that is planting trees, and a wide variety of trees based on the ecosystem. It's not just planting trees like that and relying on carbon credits. They are going after customers that pay today for ecosystem restoration. So for example, the mining industry, from a compliance perspective, they are forced to restore ecosystem on old mines. They spend millions of dollars doing this work, so there are customers today paying for it. So it's really going after those customers and benefiting from those markets to restore the ecosystems.
Okay, thank you. And also on safeguards, indigenous communities safeguard about 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity. So they're looking after it and they're involved in it. So we can't really talk about biodiversity or nature more generally without involving indigenous people and local communities. Axel, I wonder if you can tell a little bit about your work with Land Life, and just more generally how you can include indigenous people and local communities in nature tech, how nature tech can include them, and also how you can include them in nature restoration. And then Nicholas, maybe if you want to add to that for some coastal communities, which is also really important.
Yeah, for sure, because as soon as you talk about land restoration, right, this land belongs to someone.
Yeah.
And you're right that a lot of the land belongs to indigenous communities or local communities, and any work that we do, right, certainly is done in very close collaboration with the landowners. There is a lot that goes into it. There is, first of all, understanding the land with them. Sometimes lands have very specific elements in them, very specific meanings, so you need to kind of work around them. But maybe more importantly, a lot of those people want to conserve, but they also need to have some revenue. And this is where I completely agree with what you say. We need to have business models that work, right? And one way of doing this is also around creating for the communities the knowledge, the skills to maintain the forest that you're going to replant, but also to have access. We work a lot with the voluntary carbon market, and also to have access to some of the credits that will come. So that will also bring some revenue diversification. If I could maybe just rebound also on what you were mentioning, Laurie, I think that those two topics of economic and scaling up, I think are very clear for the nature-based startup. I think quite often we are, from an economics perspective, looking at all the way to improve across the chain and the process on how to make it more viable. So one of the things, for example, that we work on is that normally you plant only during a certain season, right? You have the planting season during which you can plant. And with climate change, those planting seasons are becoming both more unpredictable and a little bit shorter. So it's really hard to work around them. So one of the things that we are looking at are also, for example, coated seeds that you can put in the ground and that will germinate when the conditions are right for them. So that kind of frees you up from the planting season, and this is a way to then manage your costs and also to create that scalability. So I think that's very, very high on, at least on our, but I think I can speak for the sector, on all of the startup, or in our case, scale up. And the thing is more around, once we start to have that formula right, is about having the investment to really scale it up, because there is some, of course, investment to do, and the investment is, of course, at the start. When you plant a forest, it's at the beginning of the life of the forest, while the credits will come later on. So we have this moment where we need to find also the investors who will help to scale this, and the corporation and the market conditions to sustain the market, because that will also give us more stability and ways to then make sure that we create that revenue diversification for the landowners and for the communities as well.
Super. Nicholas, you continue on that.
Yeah, so I'm not thinking it might have been you that mentioned it, that actually indigenous people are some of the best for looking after their nature.
Yes, it's true.
And this is certainly also something that we've seen, not necessarily through our own direct activities, because we're mainly based in Europe, we don't work very much with indigenous people. But what we're seeing, for example, with colleagues in Canada, is that they have created very good ties with the local indigenous people, who have a real stake and real interest in managing their natural resources. Very often it might be an important source of income, it can have an important cultural component. And what we're seeing is that they're very willing to adopt new technology. For example, you mentioned eDNA earlier, which is, of course, a topic that gets used a lot, but they've been very quick to jump on board with this technology. And now, so they're working very closely with a number of laboratories to adopt the new techniques and then make the data available for them so they can make the right decisions. But we are also facing an enormous barrier between what these people can do, and it's also in places outside of the developed world. There's a serious barrier in terms of finances and able to deploy new technologies and even make the most of their own biodiversity. When you look at some of the really exciting things happening in biotech or in new sensors and so on, they're all happening in the Northern Hemisphere, more or less. And there isn't the capacity in many countries outside of the Northern Hemisphere to do so. So in order to help them make the most of it as well, there needs to be an investment in local capacity as well, that we're not producing everything just in Europe, North America, and Australia and Japan. That this is also something that can be done locally. And I think for what we have certainly learned in terms of starting to work with environmental genomics and so on is that there is no one-size-fits-all. Everybody has a different approach, wants to use the tool differently because they all have different needs. I might be interested in fish, but they're interested in mussels, or they're interested in something else. And so we need to have things that are adaptable to what they're doing, and I can't think of a better way to make sure that our new technology will work in a diverse setting then working with the people from diverse places to say, okay, well, you have knowledge of this. You know what the problem is. Can my tech be applied here? Can you be a user of it? Or does it need an adaptation or a component or a piece of software that allows the analysis or the tool to be adaptable to your environment? So I think we need to also remember that there's a capacity we need to build to make sure that the tech can be used, and actually there's an investment from their side and a novel approach. Because we have, I'm glad that we're talking much more now about cost effectiveness, because 10 years ago we weren't. And you know, when we think, oh, we can deploy this in Europe and so on, sure, but you couldn't deploy it anywhere else in the world. We're now also conscious that things need to be cheaper. Our investors are conscious that this needs to be scalable and cost effective. And I think that also then becomes much more so if we have a broader investment in people and where we're doing things, not just one place. And very often they will come with a cheaper alternative because they're not as tech dependent as we are. We solve all our problems with a new tech or a new app or something. They don't have that luxury. We have a lot to learn also in terms of how we make things sustainable and cheaper by working with people, indigenous people.
Thank you. We have a few questions from the audience, actually. I wanted to start with this one, Laurie, that I think was probably for you. Many of these companies are impact first with grants, NGOs, and crowdfunding as main funders. What's needed to make them VC fundable?
I'm going to repeat again the same thing. For VC fundable, you need to make sure that the business you are building is, and the solution is cost effective, as you just mentioned. Because ultimately, people, do they care about biodiversity, green solution? Yes. But are they going to pay more for it? No. No for consumers, because we all have our bills to pay, we have to take care of our kids, we have to, plenty of things. Biodiversity, unfortunately, comes after. And for industries are all very cost sensitive. So again, think about cost-effective solutions and think about scalability. Can your business grow? As an investor, I'm looking at businesses that can go from maybe zero now in terms of revenue because you are in the lab to $100 million revenue in roughly 7 to 8 years. So how do you get to those $100 million revenue? Just keep that in mind when you pitch to investors.
Thank you. One for you, Axel, I think. Is it worth pursuing solutions through rewarding farmers or regulating them? This is from James Walker, who's Australian Farmer of the Year.
I think probably there should be a little bit of both, if I'm honest. I think it is fair to reward people who do, the good work. I think we were discussing that earlier as well. When you do restoration, you also should be doing restoration in a high integrity way. We have seen, I think both of you live in Portugal, and I think we've seen in Portugal a number of land restoration that were done with, eucalyptuses, which are great for capturing carbon, but are pretty much a disaster for everything else. So, for example, our company, we do plant eucalyptuses, but we plant them in Australia. When we work in Spain or in Portugal or in the US, we use the native species that we have there in a diverse way. So somehow I think that the market needs to find a way to reward the right behavior that is long-term. And this is where I think well thought of regulation and encouragements can help to bring that bar towards the right kind of behavior. I think that is going to be quite important and going to create the integrity that is needed on top of the cost and the scalability. We also need to do it in a high integrity way because this is what's going to lead to the result that we want. So I would say really we need a bit of a carrot and a stick in this case.
Right. Thank you. And here's one for you, Nicolas. How can startups get paid for monitoring, protecting, and increasing biodiversity in marine settings with complex ownerships and jurisdictions? That's from Petr Todorov from Bioinnovation Institute.
That is an excellent question. So there are increasing needs for monitoring in general. So there's also obligations to monitor, particularly before large investments or putting in place a new wind farm or monitoring invasive species in a port. Most authorities don't have that sort of capability. Academia most definitely does not. And I think, so this is a very much an area where tech and private sector can come in and offer solutions for those aspects. So whereas it may not be a 10-year monitoring program, it could be very punctual. But I think in certain instances, like port authorities, they will probably want something in place for a long time. They don't want to do it necessarily themselves, to be looking for an expert to do so. So I think it's a matter of looking what the needs are, what's happening in regulations. So in terms, now I think the farmer's question was a really interesting one. And I think in general, there needs to be a very close work between regulating authorities, private sector, and academia, because the uncertainty makes things very complicated. And I think a commitment to having a certain framework in place will allow more investment, it allows certainty, companies know what regulations are coming at them. But I would say that that's probably where I would look if I wanted to try and make money off the monitoring. In any case, there is a big gap when it comes to sensors and robotics in general. There's in Europe a real wish to create a competitive sensor industry to the one in North America. And that means that especially in terms of biodiversity and biology, there are very, very few sensors. There are some that are in the testing stages, but there's nothing really solid on the market. Most are derivatives, or based on biochemical indicators. We haven't got solid biological approaches yet. So in any case, developing those things and making sure that they're compatible with autonomous vehicles is really, really important. So I'd say there's two aspects. There's the investment in what's missing in terms of technology, and there's offering the services that aquaculture people or a port authority or something need in order to meet their environmental requirements and impact assessments.
Thank you. I wondered if you could each of you just give a call to action for the audience, a bit of a reason for getting involved in solutions that help us get to a nature-positive world. Maybe, Axel, you could start us off.
I think we will probably repeat a lot of what we said throughout, but I would say for people to get involved, there is a lot of, it's a big challenge, but there are going to be a lot of opportunities. I think Laurie, you're right, there are some markets that are already somewhat there because they are more mandatory, but that will evolve, that will develop, and I think we need overall to have that transformation towards a more nature-positive way of working. And I think the time is right for people to really go deep and understand and meet with the different startup and scale-ups for the investors, and maybe at times help us sharpen our business cases. But for the most part, I would say right now, I know for us where we are at the scale-up phase. We're accelerating. We feel we have we have ironed out the technology, how we work, how to succeed in what we do, how to do it well. We've had 10 years of experience. So right now also it's about people taking a little bit the jump and becoming more familiar with us. We go through very long due diligences, I have to say, because people do not yet have necessarily that familiarity with nature-based solutions. So I would encourage certainly investors to spend more time, to get more familiar with this domain, because I think we are ready for scale up.
Great. Nicholas, do you want to give us a quick call to action?
Yeah, so I'm a big believer in trying to get the three major actors together, which is government and science and industry, because the way we're going at the moment, it requires all three components to find the solutions. Nobody benefits from the current system where industry talks to academia and government talks to industry and academia talks to government. Mm-hmm. There's too many parallel conversations going on when they should be had together. And so my general encouragement would be actually is to go out and work more closely with the academics. I know this is not always easy and sometimes challenging, especially on a time scale, but there's an awful amount of information, good idea, knowledge that you will be able to benefit from, and I would also argue would allow you to leap forward in your thinking and your planning. There's far too many silos going on, and I think even in an industry, we would benefit from working much closer together. The advances we've made in academia in the last 10, 20 years as we dropped competition and focused on collaboration has been immense. We're sharing knowledge, we're sharing resources, means we're not making the same mistakes, we're benefiting from what others did, we're learning from negative results, and I think we would go much faster as well in tech development if we weren't always so cagey about what we did, and we shared resources and data on a number of key points. So that is what I would really encourage, is be more open and collaborative, and speak to the academics as well. There's a lot to offer there in terms of information, knowledge, and technology.
Thank you. Larry, final thought.
Final thoughts, we need to act now, and we need to set our sights higher. So we need more funders building scalable businesses, that's one, but we need more investors supporting those funders. And again, I mentioned it earlier, nature tech solutions and nature tech companies can grow fast, can scale fast, and make large returns for the investors. So we'll take a look at it. We've done it. We have 25% of our portfolio companies that are focused on nature-based solutions that are performing very well. So I hope we'll be more investors supporting those companies.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. We're out of time now, so thanks to all of you and to all the audience, and yeah, thanks. Goodbye.